everyone. Today we have the pleasure and the great joy to welcome Mark Sullivan, a very beloved author by Romanian readers, and also the author of bestsellers, The Last Green Valley, the most recent, and Beneath a Scarlet Sky. We published both titles at Editura 3. So welcome, Mr. Sullivan, in Romania, online.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here.
You know, we in Romania, in this part of Europe, we kind of living the last Green Valley. We are seeing our neighbors, Ukrainians, coming to our borders. I think maybe 500,000 just passed to Romania. Romania is just a transit country for them. They are heading to another European countries or maybe another destination in the world.
Yes.
But it's a very tense period for us, for them. It's terrifying.
Yes.
And I know that you started the Last Green Valley with a dedication to the refugees.
I did.
And how do you feel these days? How do you feel the connection between your story and the current events you see on the news?
First of all, I wish it wasn't happening. But I remember reading a book called Trinity when I was a young man. And the epigraph, the book was by Leon Uris, and the epigraph was saying, there's nothing new. We're just reliving the past again and again and again. And that is certainly true today. I had no idea when I started researching the Last Green Valley that we were going to see the kind of refugee crisis that I describe in the book occur all over again almost 75 years later. But here it is, and it's happening, you know. And the book tells the story, of course, of an ethnic German family who they've lived in Ukraine for over 100 years. And they get chased out of Ukraine by the return of the Stalinists and the Soviet Union. And they go all the way across, of course, Romania, which is why I went there and did a lot of research and met some amazing people who remembered that first big refugee movement. In the book, there's two described. One when the Martels run, and then one immediately after the war when like 20 million people start walking. I'll tell you this, I'm incredibly impressed by the Ukrainian people and how hard they're fighting for their freedom. It's not surprising when you look at their history and especially in light of what Stalin did to Ukraine in 1932-33 when he starved to death, you know, somewhere between 4 and 6 million people because they weren't kowtowing to Moscow. So in many ways, it's a very similar situation. And when you have that in your background, you know you're going to fight because the opposite, you already know what's coming, and it's intolerable, so you're going to fight.
Yeah. Beneath the Scarlet Sky started with the confession of Pino Lelia, an extraordinary young man during World War II. The Last Green Valley had a quite similar starting point, the real story of the Martel family.
Yes.
I think our readers would like to know, how did you discover the story?
Yeah, I was told by a lot of people after the publication of Beneath the Scarlet Sky that I would never find another story like it. And you know what, I really believed I would. And sure enough, all these letters started coming at me, emails, messages, people describing their grandmother, grandfather, or something that happened to a person that they knew, and that, you know, reminded them of Beneath the Scarlet Sky. So I figured out that I had to have some kind of criteria. What was I looking for? What kind of story was I looking for? And I quickly came up, when I thought about Beneath the Scarlet Sky, I realized that it was inherently moving, inspiring, healing to some people and actually transformative to other readers. And so I wrote those 4 words down, and I started analyzing all the stories, and a lot of them came close. But it wasn't until I was at a speaking engagement at a noontime Rotary meeting here in where I live in Bozeman, Montana, and a guy comes up afterwards and says, do you know these people, the Martels? And I said, you mean like the construction people? And he said, yeah. He said, the whole time I was reading Beneath the Scarlet Sky, all I could think of was the story of how the Martels came to America. You need to hear it. So 2 days later, I end up going to Bill Martel's house, and my navigator tells me to turn left into this older neighborhood, and I'm getting this strange feeling, and I can't quite understand why, until I get to Bill's driveway, and I park and I get out, and then it hits me that I can't be 200, 250 yards from where I heard the story of Pino Lella. So I knock on the door, and Bill lets me in. He's a great guy, and he starts telling me the story of how his parents ran from the Soviets with him and his brother Walter in effectively a covered wagon with 2 horses. And within 10 minutes, I'm sitting forward in my chair. And within an hour, I know I'm doing it because it's hitting everything, all my criteria. It's hitting it right on the numbers. And we end up going to Ukraine together after my trip through Moldova and Romania. In Romania, I'll start there. I got to meet, as I said, some incredible people, some of who remembered this. And one of them was a guy named, I think I'm pronouncing his name right, Georgi Vasilescu, who is actually a Romanian national hero and one of the last survivors of Stalingrad. And I met him in Berlin, and he was like 97, 98 when I met him, and he's still alive as far as I know. And he had this remarkable story to tell, first of all, about Stalingrad and the Battle of the Elbow of the Don, which is a famous, a battle, a part of Stalingrad that the Romanian army participated in, including Mr. Vasilescu. And he got hit by a mortar and then woke up and knew without a doubt he was going to live through the war, and starts walking through the Battle of Stalingrad, burying Romanian soldiers. And he basically believes in his heart that he's destined to become a beekeeper, and that's what keeps him alive. Even after he gets sent back to Romania, and Romania switches sides from an alliance with Germany to an alliance with Russia, and he's immediately imprisoned. And he escapes, and he's imprisoned, and he escapes, and he's imprisoned, and he escapes, and he finally gets imprisoned for 4 years, and he survives it and walks home by believing he's going to become a beekeeper. And I don't think I've met very rarely people that, hit you right here, and he was one of them. And so he ended up becoming part of the story, of course, a fictionalized version of him. So that was wonderful. And then going to Ukraine with Bill and Walter and actually finding the ruins of the home that they fled at the beginning of the book was extraordinarily emotional for them, to see the whole course of their life. And for me to be there, to witness that, them coming to grips with what had happened. And then going to Poltava, which is right now a city that's actually under attack in Ukraine. And we went there and we found the museum where Mr. Martel was imprisoned in the basement. And we got to go down into that basement, and standing there in this room where Mr. Martel was imprisoned with 500 other men, many of them dying at night. Again, it was just, it shakes you to your core when you realize that these things happen to real people. And, we came to grips with that when we went into that basement. And all these kind of things informed that book about refugees just trying to find, in the Martel's case, they were just trying to get out of the way of the war. And, so many people that we're seeing right now are just trying to get out of the way of the war. You said to yourself, 500,000 have come through Romania. You know, this isn't the first time this has happened. You know, it's happened many times, people, refugees coming through Romania and all of Eastern Europe. It's sad.
Sad, yes.
Yes.
And I thought the other day that the history repeats itself, because at the beginning of the 20th century we had a war, then a pandemic, and afterward the economical crisis, and now we had the pandemic. Now we are in the war, and God knows.
Right. It's true.
Yeah. So beside the visit to Ukraine and other visits to Romania, Moldova, do you remember the most intense episodes of this research journey?
Yeah, I mean, meeting Mr. Vasilescu was a big thing for me. It really set the tone of what I was seeing, because he remembered, you know, the ethnic Germans running and caught between the two armies. He remembered that. And then I was able to talk to a lot more people. That was set up by, I had a guide, a great guide, out of Bucharest, who helped me find all these people, Florian Bergui, and he was amazing. He found all these people in their 90s who remembered it all the way across, right? I went through Cluj-Napoca, I interviewed people there, Oradea at the other end. And because I was able to talk to people who were witnesses, it just gave the book an incredible level, I think, of authenticity as to how it happened. And I was constantly trying to put my brain in the eye, you know, in the role of the Martels, because here was I was driving across Romania. They were riding in a horse and cart. And when you go, of course, to Eastern Romania, you see all these similar horses and carts even today. And so I was able to get inside their minds, and as we rolled, as I understood where I was in the story, you know, every place that I stopped became more and more intense. When they went through the mountains near Transylvania, and, you know, horses were crashing and going down the side of the mountain, you know, I was really able to put myself right there, which was fairly amazing, and I think really helps the book tremendously.
It is really a very strong book, and in description, in the characters, what part of the story required more of your imagination?
Well, so I had to do a lot of research about Ukraine, Romania, Moldova, and I found that what happened is that the Holocaust, what we think of the Holocaust, the final solution, the killing of the Jews, happens after Hitler invades Russia, and he goes in 3 different ways, 3 different fronts, and there were people who opposed the Germans among the ethnic Germans, and there were people that supported German among the ethnic Germans. A lot of these ethnic Germans have been cut off from Germany for like a century, right? Certainly the Martel family. But I wanted to understand why certain ethnic Germans had participated in the Holocaust, right? So I read a lot about that, and I found out that some of them actually had, some of them had fought it, some of them had, and I was struggling trying to figure out a way to bring all this together, right? I knew Mrs. Martel had helped a Jewish woman get papers, falsification papers that showed she was German, and then she could escape. But I didn't know, quite where this all fit in until I interviewed Mr. Martel's great-granddaughter, and his wife had told her, granddaughter, sorry, Mrs. Martel, Adelina Martel, had told him that Mr. Martel, once they got back to their lands after Germany invaded, had to put a roof on the house he was building, and he had to go to this nearby town to get roofing materials. He was supposed to be gone a day and a half. He was gone 4.5 days. He came back shaken, rattled, And she asked him what had happened, and he said he was held by the Nazis and he was forced to bury Jews that they had killed. So I had to face this, and we know nothing else. That's all I knew. So I had to understand what he might have went through. It turns out that I was able to find the town where it happened. It wasn't far. It was about 18 kilometers away, which makes sense given, he was supposed to be gone a day and a half in a horse and carriage. And 8,000 Jews were shot there early in September of 1943, which is when he said he buried the Jews. So that entire backstring is fictionalized. Him being forced, I had to reimagine it based on the historical accounts of what occurred there, as well as my own imagination.
So we have a historical fiction.
Yes.
But it's not just historical fiction. I think it could be read as a companion book in personal transformation, because it speaks to the reader about life, death, sacrifice, love, generosity, evil, forgiveness. How did you experience the writing of The Last Green Valley as at emotional level, psychological level?
Yeah.
How hard was it for you to tell the story?
Well, it was very hard for me to tell a story in certain parts. The scenes in Dubasari where the Jews are shot was some of the hardest stuff I've ever had to write in my life. It was very, very difficult, and it took a lot out of me. The issue of this sort of emotional transformation that the reader goes through, I think, was in large part predicated on a conversation that I had with Bill and Walter when we were leaving Ukraine. And Walter and I were heading to Germany to retrace their mother's route in her escape out of Soviet-controlled Germany. And I asked Bill, I said, correct me if I'm wrong, but your dad seemed, prior to going into the prison camp, pretty much the kind of guy who did not want to be noticed. He tried to keep his head down. He tried not to be ambitious because he had realized under communism that being ambitious, being smart, actually is a detriment, and you get sent to the gulag. He had seen it happen to his own father. He had seen it happen to Adeline's father, who never came back. And his father came back a broken man. So I said, he's this one way, and yet when he escapes from the prison camp, I won't call him James Bond, but he has all these, all of a sudden he just wildly changes, and he takes every opportunity to try to escape and to make his way all the way across Soviet-controlled Europe into the British zone, which is just extraordinary. And this level of risk-taking and recognizing opportunity continues the rest of his life. And it was not there before, and yet it continues. So I asked him why, and they said, well, there's no doubt that something happened to him in that prison camp, but he didn't talk to him about it much. And Bill said, it's his belief, Bill's belief, that his father probably had one or two allies that worked with him, rebuilding the hospital, doing all the cement work, working on the death detail, which is all true, all true. And he said, you're just going to have to figure out how it happened, Mark. And I remember saying, okay, I got just the guy to help him, and it was the beekeeper, which came out of the blue just by meeting Mr. Lupulescu, and it ended up being an integral part of the story. And Lupulescu really is the one who, Emil begins the story, we don't understand why, but he's lost his faith in God, right? And the beekeeper is the one who shows him that he was not abandoned by God, quite the opposite. And his faith is renewed. And not only that, he becomes a fundamentally different person through that transformative process. He realizes that it's not what happens to you in life, it's what the meaning you give it. And that meaning can be empowering or it can be withering. It's up to you. And he finds that out, and he continues the rest of his life to live that way. Because it really is, deep down, it's the story of Emil's transformation. It's certainly Adeline's story too. I mean, she is an amazing person and just an incredibly cohesive force in that family. But in terms of the person who's radically changed, it's Emil.
Yeah. Have you, I don't know, have you respected the descriptions you received from Emil and Adeline from their family, or you enriched their portrait?
Well, I got a lot. I was lucky that there were 2 95-minute or so, 100-minute recordings of Emil and Adeline that were done in the late 70s. And the Martels had kept it up, moving it between all the different, cassette tapes and then CDs and then MP3s. And so I was able to actually listen to them, describing a lot of it. Not a lot about the prison camp, but he did describe how he used to gather scraps of wood and sell it to the cooks. And he worked on the death detail. He was building the hospital. He was a cement mixer. All these things he describes, but he didn't like to talk about it. Adeline spoke English, first of all, way better than he did. And I was able to hear in great detail the story of her journey from her. And then I was able to interview, of course, Bill and Walter extensively and traveled with them. And then Mrs. Martel and Emil, but especially after Emil was gone, Adeline had a very close relationship with all her grandchildren. And I was able to interview all of them. And each of them had a different tale to tell. And I was able to bring that all together and weave it. That's where almost all of it came from.
Yeah, I felt that they survived this tremendous journey because they were such a strong couple. They were different, but very strong. Their communication was extraordinary. They
Yes.
could talk about everything.
Yes.
But they also have, each of them had their secrets because
They did. Yeah. And Adeline goes from a position of strong faith to during his imprisonment and the starting of the apparatus of the secret police in East Germany, she goes through her own crisis of faith, right? She goes from faith to doubt, and he goes from absolute doubt to faith, and they both end up, at the end, the thing I always think of as the end of their, big story is when they reunite on the train station, at the train station. And they both look at each other, having gone through like one incredibly brutal experience after another, and they both consider their life a miracle. It's amazing. Yeah.
And I think maybe for Adeline, it's a understandable journey from faith to doubt. But from Emil, it was a miracle journey because I wonder if he hadn't met Gheorghe, what would happen with him, because Gheorghe planted the seed of the future fate of Emil.
Yes, that's correct. If he hadn't met Corporal Gheorghe, he wouldn't have had that transformation. But that seems to me that's the way life works. You get who you need. If you ask for it, you get who you need. And I've found a lot of things in my life have had this sort of serendipitous effect where, and I always leave room for it when I'm researching it. And meeting the beekeeper was just that. It was a total, I had no idea who Mr. Vasilescu was until I met him, and until they told me who he was. So I didn't go searching him out. He just kind of appeared in my life, and you know, it was an extraordinary gift just getting to meet him and being able to write about him. And I wanted to have that aspect of life present in Emil's, that sometimes we're sent, you know, I don't know about angels, but we're sent the people we need, the spirits we need. And he certainly did get that.
Yeah. I don't know, maybe I'm mistaken, but in Romania, in Ukraine, and maybe in Russia, the Orthodox belief gives you that in a some kind of form. I mean, you put yourself in the hands of God.
Yes.
People in the countryside, they say this maybe daily. I put myself in the hands of God, and everything He gives me for a reason.
Mhm.
And the life philosophy of George is very common. I mean, I recognize it in my grandparents, and it's in our blood.
Good. I'm glad you see it there. That's wonderful. You know, it is that moment where Emil makes that leap of faith, right? He's had this reawakening in his faith, but not only that, in his thought process, how he thinks about his life, about everything that's happened to him. And he believes that he's going to escape one way, right? They spent all this time plotting to escape on the pony from the death detail, and he gets pulled off it, right? He gets sent to the train station to shovel, and then all of a sudden it just appears in front of him. There's the escape, and he makes this extraordinary leap of faith, and he just gets on. And you got to ask yourself, would the old Emil have done that? I don't know. I don't think so.
No.
But he does. And from that point forward, you know, all these roadblocks get put in front of him, of course, but he's going. There's absolutely no doubt in his mind that he's going to get there. And it's an extraordinary thing.
Yes. Let's go back to the title, the metaphor in title.
Yes.
The last green valley.
Yeah.
What is the meaning for our readers?
Well, first of all, where it came from. Mrs. Martel, evidently, by a couple of accounts, worked for a Jewish woman in Bursula, Ukraine. I can't remember if it's still called that, but that's what it was called at the time. And the woman was very, very kind to her. It was an older woman, and Adeline cooked for her and was her maid as well. And the woman had a folio of paintings, you know, and Adeline used to look through them, and there was this one painting of this beautiful green valley with a river running through it and all these mountains around with snow caps, and she just loved it, and she liked to look at it. She imagined herself living there someday. And you know, when in the book, when they take off, and you know, it's like any trip you take with little kids. Mom, when are we going to get there? Where are we going? And she starts describing to the children the painting, right? And this idea that they're going to this beautiful green valley, you know, surrounded by mountains, where they'll have freedom and they'll be allowed to live their lives as they want. This, of course, becomes a big metaphor in the search for, you know, first of all, salvation on both their parts, but it also represents, you know, a metaphorical Eden, a paradise that they believe they'll find, and they find it. You know, when they get to Montana and the Gallatin Valley where I live, that's just what it looks like. You know, it's a big, broad valley with a big river running through it and 5 mountain ranges all around it. And she was overwhelmed to see it. She said she would never leave, and she never did.
Wonderful. Did you discover the next story?
Yes, I have. again, I was told I'd never find another story like Beneath the Scarlet Sky or Last Green Valley, and I said, I think I will. And so in the spring of 2019, a very good friend of our family's died, a guy named Alan Hayes. And both my sons had lived with Alan in Salt Lake City when they were trying to make the United States ski team. And my oldest son was one of the executors of Alan's will, along with some of the other boys that had lived with Alan over the years trying to make the ski team. And one of them was the commander of SEAL Team 6. He had gone, after ski racing, he had gone to Annapolis and then became a SEAL and then rose to become the commander of the most difficult part of the SEALs. And they spent a bunch of time together, and they're telling stories about Alan and other stories about their lives. And Eric tells this story to Connor, and Connor calls me up the next day and says, Dad, I think I heard your next book. And so it took me a while, but I finally was able to meet with Eric and with the other guy who had heard the story, a guy named Mick Mulroy, who at the time was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Trump administration. And he had been a former CIA guy and had been stationed in Kampala, Uganda, of all places. And that's where he heard this extraordinary story about a 14-year-old boy, a 14-year-old girl that get kidnapped by this messianic warlord along with 20,000 other children. And they get turned into soldiers. And what they go through is, the training is worse than the SEALs, what the SEALs go through. And many of them die. It's another one of these stories of, you can't believe that, first of all, it's man's inhumanity to man, and yet the story is about how these children hold on to their humanity when they're in an inhuman situation. And roughly halfway during the 10-year ordeal, they meet and they genuinely fall in love. And the power of love saves them and allows them to escape and then to become part of an effort to bring all child soldiers home. That's what the book's about.
Sounds great. I can't wait to read it.
Good. I'm glad you're going to read it.
When will it be published?
I believe next year. It's due in September, so it'll probably be fall of 23. That's what I'm figuring.
Mr. Sullivan, thank you very much for sharing all these wonderful things with us. And I hope we will see you in Romania sometime soon, maybe in a visit. And we all hope to have this neighborhood war stopped.